What's up, everybody? Peter Exodus O'Coffer here. And I was excited about the rise and fall of rock and roll, uh, the funk in the one, and now I am doing the rise of hip hop. And super excited about this one. This is another one I've been waiting to do for a long time. And it's been several months. It's been sitting back there, but you gotta lay the bricks and get to that position. There's a logical process and steps that you need to do, and you can't jump around really. So first of all, I am blessed to be there, and actually alive to experience when hip hop left New York City in the form of Rapper's Delight, and kind of reminds me of a little bit of ZZ Top has a song called "When Jesus Left Chicago," and it was interesting because back in the late 40s and early 50s, you had national radio stations. I mean, a lot of radio stations were only on the air for a few hours and went off at sundown and whatnot. And So some of the big cities had them, but so the members of ZZ Top lived in Texas, and a good night with good weather, they could get the blues stations from Chicago, and that's how powerful some of these antennas were. I mean, New York had stations like that, and so that's what when Jesus left Chicago by ZZ Top, that's what that was about. And so, in some ways, I kind of had that moment. It would have been the spring of 1980, because I believe 1979 was when Rapper's Delight dropped, and I was in Columbus, Ohio, and nobody. I mean, in New York, they probably played Rapper's Delight on the radio, and there's one black radio station in Columbus, Ohio, WVKO. They did not play rap. When I moved from Columbus in 1986, early 1986, I still don't think they played rap. So, and Columbus wasn't the only city like that. I mean, I'm going to go, on the limb and say, the majority of black radio stations did not play Rapper's Delight when it dropped. And the history, the record companies did not take hip hop very seriously. They thought it was a gimmick. And Sylvia Robinson, put out Rapper's Delight. It was, and she has an interesting story. But that was Rapper's Delight was the song of the summer, so to speak. I mean, everywhere you went that summer, it was leaking out of people's windows, in the August heat at night, the windows rolled down, people driving down the street, Rapper's Delight was the song that was thumping. So that's how, I mean, it was really word of mouth, and I'm not sure if anybody's ever figured out how word of mouth moves and how dances move. I mean, the black community is very good at, before YouTube and TikTok, there's always been a way, even for cultural things to move across the country and black communities. Even without even back in the 70s, without even Soul Train, things just kind of move. And I've never, it's kind of one of the mysteries. I think maybe somebody's broken it down and maybe a sociologist somewhere. I haven't seen it. If you know of anybody who has, please mark it in the comments, and I'd love to, delve into that. So yeah, I mean, Rapper's Delight broke. It spread, and folks thought it was a fad, and then in 1982. The message drops, Like, man. So, I mean, I remember Rapper's Delight, and I kind of lost track. And that was in middle school. I was just getting out of middle school when Rapper's Delight dropped. And then the message dropped. And at the time, I was in a mostly white high school in the suburb of Chicago. But I think Chicago WBMX, if I'm not mistaken, was the black radio station. They actually did play the message. Um, so that was the second, that was the string, and there were other songs in between that were popular, but those are the two that broke through, sort of into the mainstream. And then, geez, things I didn't even write down are popping up. But I remember Flashdance, the movie, and this was around the time of the message. So I think that was 82 and 83, and that's when breakdancing went mainstream. And I remember just when Flashdance, I mean, I was at a mostly white high school, 550, 500, 600 students, me and one black family were the black students there. I just remember my white friends freaking out when they saw Flashdance, like, oh my gosh, that breakdancing is so cool. So so this is early hip hop. And tell you a funny story. So I graduate in high school in Columbus and started at Ohio State. In the mid 80s, and I told myself I'm going to buy every rap album that comes out, because I think most people, hip hop was kind of existed in New York City, but and then the term was used in Rapper's Delight, but I don't know if outside of New York folks were actually really using the term hip hop. So, but that's my funny story, because I was so in love with hip hop, and I was gonna buying every hip hop album ever that comes out. And at the time you could count them. I mean, and at the time too, the mid '80s. I mean, I had what you call the big three. Now Curtis Blow, was before the big three, and he was probably I think Curtis might have been the first one to drop an album. But to me, that mid '80s, the big three were Run DMC, the Fat Boys, and Houdini, and those were like the first ones to drop albums and drop consecutive albums. And then Curtis Blow was there before them and dropped consecutive albums. But Curtis was a little older. These guys, Houdini and Run DMC and the Fat Boys. I mean, they were all in their early 20s. So I mean, they were either very young boomers or just at where I'm at, the start of Gen X. And yeah, so I was gonna buy every hip hop album that came out, and I think by '87 it was like, okay, I can't keep up with this. So that's my funny kind of story at the beginning of hip hop. So hip hop's kind of an interesting, following, the scene from the mid '80s to the late '80s. I mean, it's still heavily New York, city based, and there are some LA acts breaking through, but really, and I'm going off notes again. I didn't do a big outline. I usually have a bigger outline, but as I'm going along, I'm just remembering, and it's just kind of cool, some of the stuff I'm remembering. So one of the big turning points in hip hop was, NWA, Straight Outta Compton. A lot changed. I mean, Ice-T precedes, NWA, but NWA was a game changer, and that was the um, two things. I mean, it was the beginning of gangster rap, but it's also when West Coast rap came up and sort of, um, in some ways, became the equal to New York City. Um, and it's just interesting, culturally. I mean, I remember the first time I heard NWA, and everybody else was like, "What the hell is this?" They said, "What?" and it was hardcore. I mean, it's mainstream now, but there's you know pre-American culture straight out of Compton and post-American culture straight out of Compton. Two very different things, and that cultural shift, kind of. I mean, everything doesn't happen at once, and it's a gradual thing. But I think, you know, let me give you an example. Being my Gemini side's definitely coming out and jumping around. But if you would have dropped Game of Thrones in 1985, people would have lost their damn minds. Like, what the hell is this? Like, what the? So that's the you know Game of Thrones is works because culturally we're used to it and are accepting of it. So Straight Outta Compton starts that process, and really, the process and this new kind of settling of the culture, which is, to be blunt, more crass, more coarse, a lot more goes is Quentin Tarantino, one of my favorite filmmakers, and Pulp Fiction. The same reaction. People had the same reaction to Pulp Fiction that they had when NWA Straight Outta Compton dropped. Like, what the hell is this? Like, you can do this? And I can't remember Pulp Fiction won best film, but everybody was fascinated in love with Pulp Fiction just because there'd never been a mainstream movie like that, and the critics loved it. So that's kind of that hip hop, and that's really too, I think, the Straight Outta Compton, that's kind of started the rise of hip hop. Well, I mean, and I'll get when I do classic songs, I'm doing Rapper's Delight and uh, The Message. But by '88, I think hip hop became the dominant genre of black music. So I think hip hop passes R&B in '88. Now the interesting thing, there's always something that precedes that, and really, if you go back to my episode before, and in the '70s, the funk was the music of the street. That changed, with the Message. The Message was the start of where hip hop became the the uh, the music of the streets because of the politics, and the politics of the Message was a lot more stark and in your face than anything that the funk was doing, and that was the rise of crack had it started then, but the rise of the gangs and stuff. I mean, they were around. It's interesting if you listen to Ice-T, talking about the Crips in the '70s, and how, and there is literature out there on the gang culture coming out of the '70s in LA. I mean, it wasn't as hardcore. Actually, I mean, Chicago probably had a much more hardcore gang scene in the '60s than even LA. And everybody, LA's known for their gang scene, but there's interesting literature how it coalesces. But by about the '82, '83, '84, that's when the gang scene in LA really kicks off. So where I was going with that, going back, the Message kind of is when hip hop became the music of the streets in the black community, and the Straight Outta Compton is when hip hop became the music of the black community. So that 6-year trek from 82 to 86. I mean, lots of little things happen, but that, that's kind of that transition period. And of course, in the 90s, that's when, a lot of R&B acts would bring in hip hop acts, and it's still going on today, to, appeal and be, appeal to the streets and be, I always use the term street legal. So hip hop is a lot more. It covers a lot of the bases that funk did, but it's even more encompassing than funk, and obviously it's a more powerful culture than funk, because it's it's a lot more stark and in your face than funk was. So hip hop, a culture that is fiercely independent and is not assimilationist. That's the funk wasn't assimilationist either, but hip hop's always been kind of in your face. Hip hop's also a culture that purposely celebrates and markets non-dominant cultural traits. Again, funk did that, but they weren't as aggressive about that as hip hop was. And hip hop is also obviously, was and still is by some viewed as subversive. I forgot to mention this back in the in the funk my episode, but there was a time when you couldn't even say the word funk on the radio, and that's one of the reasons why they embraced it. So so when George Clinton, one of the P-Funk songs is, funk used to be a bad word. It literally used to be a bad word. So what does hip hop encapsulate? Well, it's music, it's fashion, it's dance, it's visual arts, it's literature, it's poetry, it's TV and movies, stars and power, but, it culminates on that, but it goes back further than that. And then comedy, and then even athletics, much more, so hip hop is much more encompassing. And I forgot to put literature. I had to put literature on there. That's important, because that's really how I express my hip hop kind of thing, and I'll get to that later. So one of the, as far as culturally, a lot of folks don't remember this, but if you're a Gen Xer, you'll remember New York Undercover, and that was a Fox TV show in the early 90s, and that was really the first hip hop kind of TV show. And there was a lot of hip hops. Elements to In Living Color, the Wayans, and you had the Fly Girls dancing. So yeah, that's hip hop's entree into TV. But you had Beat Street. I think Beat Street may have had 2 movies. In the mid 80s, those are the 2 that come to mind. And Crush Groove, and so these are hip hop based movies. Didn't make a whole lot of money. I haven't watched them in years, so I can't, comment on the quality by today's standards. They weren't horrible, but hip hop entrepreneurs were branching out into these other avenues and really planting the hip hop flag in a lot of different places. Unlike the funk, there was no funk movies. You didn't hear funk in 70s TV shows. But the funk was in. They did bring in Curtis Mayfield, who's a funk artist, to do Superfly, and James Brown did do a lot of soundtrack for movies. But that's the movies. The funk was not, on CBS, ABC, and NBC. And going back now, the Hollywood influence, I mentioned Power, but Black Lightning from uh, the CW, Luke Cage, Marvel from, it's over on Disney Plus, but originally that broke on Netflix. And obviously, Black Panther, the movie had, particularly the scenes out of Oakland had lots of hip hop flavor, and that shows you the reach of hip hop, even in the Hollywood. And I'm just, you can go to a bunch of the early '90s movies. I can't even, I'll think of them and drop them. But hip hop, didn't just spread in its dominance through music, but it, particularly Hollywood, had a lot to do with shaping hip hop. And there was definitely a dialogue between hip hop movies and the music. So in the early '90s, you had a whole string of hip hop influenced movies: Colors, Juice, Poetic Justice, New Jack City. New Jack City, probably the most influential of the ones I just named, because they named a musical style New Jack. Um, that whole which is the blending of R&B and hip hop. So and notice I'm spending a lot of time now talking about the rise of hip hop, talking about Hollywood, and that's not the case. Earlier in this episode I reeled off a few funk infused music from the '70s, but the funk was not in, and those were black exploitation films, and the ones that I'm naming, the movies I'm naming off now. I mean, yes, they were mostly black audiences, but these movies made pretty good money, and they were, you could go to a suburban, movie theater and see these movies. So it's a different phenomenon, and it shows you. Here I am in the early '90s, the reach of hip hop, how even how it's already growing. Interesting enough, into the early '90s, the hip hop scene for the most part is still New York City and West Coast, mainly Los Angeles and the Bay Area and Oakland, even into the '93 or so. And it's so the local scenes had not. People. Everybody else had the bug, and everybody else was rapping, but probably a lot of it, there were, the record companies were in New York and in L.A. and I think a lot of it had to do with these were where the record companies and the record people and the people with the skill set were in New York and Los Angeles. I think the interest was there, and certainly I remember a lot of people rapping and writing rhymes in the late '80s, and when I was in New Orleans. So it wasn't like I lived there, New Orleans. So it wasn't like people weren't infatuated and trying to do their own rap thing, outside of New York and LA. I just think, and still, the major labels weren't taking rap all that seriously. And I talked about in the rise and fall of rock and roll how, the rock acts never took control and never owned their own companies. Well, because of the big labels not taking hip hop seriously, the large majority of these hip hop acts, in the late '80s and into the early '90s were on, black owned, record labels. Now, as it blew, rap got big in the early '90s and blew up, there were the white, super record labels that did the distribution, so they still got paid, and they were part of the game, but they weren't necessarily on the ground floor, controlling, and but money has influence. So you know, if they didn't want something in the album, it's probably that they still, you still got to get the product to the people. So I'm not going to say they did not still have a lot of control as far as hip hop product, but there was a little, you could get away with a lot more in hip hop than you could in rock and roll, because you still, distribution's one thing, and if you're willing to sell out of your trunk and say screw distribution, then hey, you had a plan B, and some acts would do that. And so that I think overall the hip hop artists, in the late '80s and early '90s had a little more leverage on these record labels, because they had a little more than these rock acts, even though the rock acts making a lot more money. They didn't have, they didn't control much of what happened after the studio, the rock acts. So I was at Purdue in the early '90s, the rise of classic rap, and at that point, New York City. This is also the sampling era, so New York City was heavily influenced by James Brown, and the West Coast was P-Funk. And I love James, but I've said it before, my biggest influences, number one, Prince, number two, P-Funk. So I was ride or die with the West Coast scene. You had X-Clan in New York City that was, rocking the P-Funk and that fat bass, and Public Enemy would do both. I mean, they would equally sample James and P-Funk. But so yeah, I followed my love and was a West Coast dude. So how do we get in the early '90s to a point where by the late '90s there were all these bubbling scenes of hip hop, and in 1990 you could, clear definition, this is pretty clear. I mean, there were definitely differences between East Coast and West Coast rap, and I honestly think the East Coast West Coast beef was a few people with egos, and unfortunately, that beef cost Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, and Tupac Shakur their lives, but the beef that beef went away with their deaths. So I think that was more ego than, and then let's be real. I mean, New York didn't, they liked being on top of the hill, hip hop wise too. And the East Coast was right, or the West Coast is rising up to challenge them. But the bottom line is, those tensions, and that whole the East Coast versus West Coast thing went away with the tragic passing of those two hip hop legends. So this is a little inexact science, but I'm a proponent of nothing happens overnight, and got a couple acts here to me that symbolizes this. But if you notice, my music, I call my music rap, and I call it because hip hop, what we know today, really, late '90s, late '90s, what you call modern day hip hop, and I've talked about it a little bit, talking about these movies and how they promoted it and how that they fed the hip hop image. But there are acts, and this is a real exact science, because I can't tell you, of the music of these acts, what makes them important in the evolution, other than the fact they all did good music and why they were different from everybody else. But when these acts came out and I heard them for the first time, and I saw how people in the black community reacted to them. That's when I really knew that hip hop was going from just an art form or music to a lifestyle, or in a deep cultural thing. It went from, music to a way of life, so to speak. You know, Sort of like, punk was, for many years, but now punk, is going mainstream, to an extent. A version of punk is going mainstream. But, hip hop started off as an arts thing, and now it is, a worldview, a way of seeing the world, a way of interpreting the world, a way of moving through the world. Is you know, you eat certain foods, you dress a certain way. Hip hop now permeates every, for people who are, in deep and consider themselves, for lack of a better word, disciples of hip hop. They are, it's a all-encompassing, worldview. And so was the Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, and a Tribe Called Quest. And I think those three kind of ran together. So and they all dropped, I believe Jungle Brothers dropped, but they all dropped their first stuff within 3 years. And it was just, they were a little, I think, particularly De La Soul was called hip, they were kind of like, these are hip hop hippies or something like that. But they were different, and they had a different sound. They probably would be considered alternative hip hop, today. But they just had a different thing going with them. And jumping around, Gemini mode again, but going back, the early 80s, Africa Bambaataa, he had the Zulu Nation. So really, historically we got, and I don't know much about the Zulu Nation. And of course his big song was Planet Rock. But he had his own tribe, real tribe, and I don't know all the details about what that, consisted of, but that was a subculture. They kind of did their own thing, and so this idea of a hip hop culture, you can probably trace that back to Africa Bambaataa. So, going back, jumping around a little to the Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, and the Tribe Called Quest. So those were the bands where I just felt like things were deepening and a new thing was happening. And then the Wu-Tang Clan came along, and it just, everything, that's when I was like, this, hip hop is really going to a deeper level. And I don't know what it was about, the Wu-Tang Clan. Ask a Gen Xer hip hop head, about and they'll talk for hours about the Wu-Tang Clan and the effect that it had on them. I respect the Wu-Tang. I was never huge fans. I don't dislike them, but you can't argue their impact. And so the Wu-Tang Clan was a really kind of they were, their arrival on the scene was big. In some ways, that's kind of when things started to coalesce and consolidate in all these different strands of hip hop. And this idea of an alternative way of seeing the world came along, and following the Wu-Tang, that's when the markets open up for all of these other cities, and their acts jumped off. And then the symbol of that to me though was Erykah Badu. I remember when Erykah Badu dropped and going to the Black Cultural Center at Purdue, and everybody like, have you heard this album? And then she did like a in studio concert on BET, and like the day after that ran, it was like 30, 40, 50 people just sitting around talking about Erykah Badu. And of course Erykah Badu did not come out of New York City or California. So that's really, I mean, that's why I consider Erykah Badu a hip hop artist, and that's why most hip hop heads, Gen Xers, consider her too, even though I don't think Erykah's ever rapped at all on any of her songs, but she's part of that culture. And as I said in my episode on Erykah Badu, that she just kind of where she moves, stuff happens. I mean, she has a quiet, power. She's kind of like the quiet storm, and so I think by the time Baduism drops, that's when the floodgates and when hip hop goes national and really uh, and that leads, to where hip hop becomes, really the dominant cultural. And by 99, 2000, 2001, I mean, hip hop is the dominant genre. And I don't know if that's reflected in sales, but I don't know when hip hop becomes the dominant genre by sales, and then that gets, when it comes to streaming, that can get kind of dicey. But there was, by 99, 2000, 2001, to quote Reggie Jackson, hip hop was the straw that stirred the cultural drink. And certainly by now, I mean, if you go to Spotify and you look at the international list of the popular songs, and I was just looking today, and outside of China, probably 90% of the countries now have Spotify, and Spotify has lists for like 20, 30, 40 countries, their top 50. It's mostly hip hop and with reggaeton, and a lot of it isn't homegrown, but even their their local acts, whether it's Sweden or Germany or whatever, outside of South America, their local acts are reggaeton, but everywhere South American and Central American, that area, but everywhere else, if there's a 50 top 50 and you're like, well, I've never heard of that, you play it, it's probably hip hop. So, more than likely it's hip hop. So, it's interesting hearing Swedish hip hop artists and Finnish hip hop artists. But hey, it is the global music, right there with reggaeton now. And obviously EDM is big globally too, but they don't show up in the numbers, and you don't have the star quality. That's still kind of a underground kind of scene. So yeah, this is the short version of my oral history, so to speak. From my lens and my eyes on hip hop. So I mean, again, I call my music rap, but I do consider myself a hip hop artist because I've said before, I have two novels and a novella, What Burns Below, and the second book in the Centralic series. Um, and it's informed by Street Lit, and Street Lit was out before, in the early 2000s, before uh, ebooks. And it did very well. And essentially, I mean, Street Lit was power before power. Stars, that was street lit, and hip hop has always had, unlike funk, has had that, elements of the grittiness of urban life, and to be blunt about it, gangsters and drug culture, and so, I mentioned, that, Drake, still drops Jimmy Cooks and Knife Talk, so he can still kind of be street legal, and So, that aspect of my work goes into my science fiction fantasy writing. I just feel more comfortable putting it there, naturally. And I have the luxury of doing that because I as an artist, I work in two mediums, and so I have certain goals and certain things I want to do with my music, and it just fits better in literature. So even though I call my rapping songs rap and not hip hop, I do consider myself a hip hop artist because of, and not all of, obviously, not all of my fiction is street lit, but it's certainly informed by street lit, and characters and storylines are definitely rooted in street lit. Wow, so this has been a fun episode. I've enjoyed this. I obviously enjoyed the rise and fall of rock and roll and funk on the one. There's more of this coming at some point. I've already said I'm gonna do disco at some point. The punk ethos. I wanted that. I'm gonna have an episode called that. Because punk's important. I've had gained more respect for it, but we have to cover punk because I do think uh, the basics of punk have gone mainstream. Particularly with the folks under 30 today. So it has to be covered because it's important. But you have, the basics, the basics tenets of punk that are mainstream. But you still got your hardcore scene. So, look forward to all that coming, and I'm gonna keep working on more episodes and dropping them, and appreciate your support. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, please. I have 4 albums out. You can look on here on YouTube channel. I'm also on all of the streaming services, and I mentioned my fiction. If you like science fiction, fantasy, my works, you can either do ebook or you can get a paperback, and I use Amazon for that. So Peter X is so called for at Amazon.com. So appreciate your support, and I will see you next episode.